Welcome again to the writing retreat from Writing Roots. We today are going to be talking, at least I'm going to be talking, about cultural world building. So creating the cultures within the society. Last session at 1 o'clock, Leigh talked about building the world itself. Now you get to put the people in the world that you've set up. It's important to create a sense of culture, even if it's just a fantasy. And the best way to do that is to look at a real human culture and see what makes it cohesive. So we've talked about this a lot before on the podcast, but when you're building a culture, you need to remember the iceberg theory. So you have all of this on top, but what's underneath that? Certainly, it's not as small as it appears. Otherwise, it wouldn't float like that. So your world should have diverse cultures and beliefs, but not all of them are going to make an appearance in your story. So you need to decide what's best for your story. Take Lord of the Rings, for example. We saw a small collection of the people who lived in the world. In Lord of the Rings, we didn't get to go back and see the woodland elves. The only person we got from that culture was Legolas. So you decide whether you need a narrow focus on one culture, like you're just focusing on the hobbits, or are you going to have a broad focus on several, and you're going to have representations of those varied cultures within your story. You also need to rank what goes in your story based on what it needs. So the more it's necessary, the more time you're going to spend on it. And I like to kind of put it in 4 categories. You have what's necessary for the plot. People have to know this to understand the progression of the plot. And then you have what's necessary for the world building. So you have this setting and you need to create that backdrop. So you need to have that cultural foundation for them to understand the world. And then there's things that are interesting, but not necessarily necessary. So it's interesting that this particular culture likes to have a lot of spicy foods. That's probably not going to be necessary for world building or for the plot, but it is an interesting fact that you can include. And it's just like a one-line throwaway thing of course they like spicy food because they're from whatever culture it is. And then there's the unnecessary and not interesting, which really means you just need to leave it out of the book. So rank and spend the time on your cultural elements based on where they are in this list. So what is cultural world building? First, it's all about the people. Who they are, what they believe, what they want in life. A culture is the people. So who are they? What do they believe? What structures exist within their society? And what's most important to them? And what do they do with their time? A lot of the things that we do in our downtime or that we spend time on influences how our culture is perceived, especially on the outside. So let's start with the people. Who are they? This is going to come down to your races, your genders, and your species. They don't have to be the same things that we see on Earth. One of my favorite examples is the Diones. This is a drawing of a Dione from the Sanderson's Skyward universe. Diones, they don't have genders. They have stages of life. So they start off as kind of like one color, and then they decide to get together and they combine together literally. So then they're 2 different colors, and then that's a test child. So then they go out and live a little bit of a life, see how this child works out. Are they what the culture requires in their people? And if that works out, then they go on to the next stage and actually create a child and then split back apart. It's very interesting, but they're not genders, it's how their species works. So the other thing is to look at what makes the people in your world unique. So what elements do they have that you can incorporate that is different than any other culture on your world or even in our world? To know the people in your culture, you need to look at their history. What brought them to the point where they are right now? What happened in the world to create this culture? So, one example of that is from Mistborn. The Lord Ruler, how he came to power made a lot of difference in how the world was formed. And a little bit of spoilers, he had a lot of influence on the actual physical world itself when he came into power. His decisions defined the culture of his society. And then look at what matters to the current story. So if you're needing to kind of have that cultural background, look into what will have an influence on your story. If it doesn't have an influence on your story, then again, you don't want to spend a lot of time on it. You can know it, but just you don't have to include it. The next step is to know what the people believe. That is a lot of what makes a culture, is their hopes, their dreams, what they want out of life. And there's a couple of different things that they can believe. Religion has a huge, huge influence on society. If you look a lot, especially at Western cultures, the Catholic religion had major impacts on how Western culture developed. Catholic priorities were the culture's priorities for a very long time, until we had the Reformation. And the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was kind of an uprising against Catholic control, and it changed the course of Western culture. So what is important to the dominant religion will impact the way society thinks. So in your story, there's probably a religion. People, that's kind of a standard of people, is that they have something to believe in. And it doesn't have to be a belief or a religion for a deity, but it can be kind of a cultural belief in technology or society. That impacts the way people think. So some of the things that their beliefs, these influences will impact, are on things like gender roles. So in the Stormlight Archives, you have very defined gender roles. The women are, they're the writers, the artists, the scientists, the math people, they do all of that. The men are the warriors, the farmers, the physical labor. So the women focus on the mental, men focus on the physical, and the men aren't allowed to read in the main Vorin culture. Contrast that with Mistborn, where the magic system has a lot of influence on the culture itself and the Lord Ruler's beliefs, and there really aren't gender roles. Among the nobility, there's kind of a little bit of a split, but if you have the right kind of magic, it doesn't matter. You do what society expects you because you have that magic, not because you're a man or a woman. And the same thing applies to the lower class, the Ska people. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you still go out and you still do the manual labor that's necessary. So your gender roles are going to be determined by the beliefs of the society and what they classify as important. Familial obligation also plays a huge key in this. Culture plays a huge key role in familial obligation. If your culture has very strong familial ties, like a lot of Eastern cultures on Earth, there's going to be very definite roles and rules around how you treat your elders, around how you treat the children. In a lot of Eastern cultures, if you don't obey the parents or your grandparents, you always look upward in the line. If you don't pay the right homage to your ancestors, then you aren't living up to the cultural requirements of your familial obligations. You're also going to look at the wedding rites, funeral rites, big ceremonies. Those, what they believe impacts all of those kinds of things. In some cultures, it's a very personal thing, and all you have to do is go out in private, meet with the person you want to get married to, say, hey, I vow to you, you vow to me, we're good, we're married now. Other cultures require a huge ceremony. I was just talking to a friend of mine who is one of the Chinese, not actual China, but one of their influence countries, and he was invited to a traditional Chinese wedding that there's 10-course meals. That's a lot of personal posturing. That's part of the wedding rite, is that they have these big grand things that it's because of the culture that that's part of it. And then your holidays. What they believe impacts the holidays. Most holidays that we have religious origins. Halloween came from All Hallows Eve, All Saints Day, an amalgamation of pagan and Christian, mostly Christian taking over pagan holidays. Same with Christmas. A lot of these things are based on cultural. Even if you look at like Memorial Day and Veterans Day in the US, those are societal holidays, things that we celebrate to celebrate certain values that we prefer and emphasize within people, that country dedication. Clearly, I'm good with words today. Other things that you can look at for their beliefs are their fairy tales and legends. What are the myths that this culture has created? One of my favorite examples is the Raven Boys, and I'll get to it in a second. So you'll want to look at what myths exist in the world, and then apply it a little bit closer to your story itself. What ones do your characters believe? And the reason why the Raven Cycle is such a good example of this is that it's set in our world, but the characters are hunting down this myth of an old Welsh king, King Glendower, who, according to the myth, I don't know if it's a real myth or if it's just within the world, but instead of dying, he was put to sleep and then buried, and whoever wakes him gets to have a favor. And the main character, one of the main characters, his goal for many, many years has been to find King Glendower. So that's their whole thing, is that he believes in this myth, that's the whole idea of the plot. So how can you tie in this cultural belief to what your story and how your story runs? The next part of cultural world building is to look at the structure of society. How the culture has influenced how people view each other within that same culture. So one of the most common ones are your class systems. What classes are there? The most common ones are to have like a low, a middle, and an upper class. Sometimes that can be split into just two. You have your low class and your middle class. For example, again in Mistborn, you have your nobility and you have your skaa. How are those class systems determined? It doesn't have to be determined just by what you were born into. It can be determined by wealth. Those are the two the most common, is your what you were born into and then your wealth. In Stormlight, one of their class system is based on eye color. So if you have light eyes, you are in the high class, the upper class. If you have dark eyes, you're in the low class. I would be in the upper class. Probably not very high, because in both of those there's 10 more ranks. It's a little excessive. And then how are the different levels viewed by others? And more specifically, how do your characters view those other levels? So does the upper class look down on the lower class? Like in Mistborn, the nobility treat the Ska almost like labor animals, that they don't really have any value other than to do the work that we don't want to do. And then how rigid are the boundaries between the classes? Can they intermix? Can a nobility marry a Ska? In the Mistborn, absolutely not. There are very specific laws restricting the relations between nobility and Ska. And it's kind of very disturbing. But, how rigid are those? Once they kind of gets to that middle, are those boundaries more blurry? And if they go farther apart, if they're more to the extreme ends, are they more rigid? Other structures that you consider, again, your gender roles. How are those defined within the society? You want to look at age roles. One of the stories that I love in Stormlight, this isn't actual Stormlight itself, but it's a story within a story, I think it's Hoyd telling a story of this culture whose leadership was defined by how old the person was. And he was talking to this group of people who were kind of wanting to overthrow nobility. And he was like, so how do you think that worked out for him? And they were like, yeah, that seems like reasonable, because you want the oldest person to kind of be the wisest. And he was like, yeah, that's not how that worked. There's still like entire dynasties within this, because they were just very careful about assassinating anybody who might threaten the people in power. So nobody got old in this society because they just kept killing each other. And then again, what are your family structures? Is it where you have to pay respect and listen to your elders, or is it more free? And how defined is that within your culture? And how much does it matter? And then your occupational your occupational structures. Is it like a hierarchy within your work structures? So if you have a business, is it a lot of Western businesses where you have the low workers, and then you have the managers, and you have your bosses, and then you have your owners, and you have your shareholders? How is that organizational structure broken down within various occupations? And then when you're world building, you have to consider, along kind of with their beliefs, what is most important to them? What values, what morals are most important to the people within the society? How does society specifically value life? Is it seen as something that should be protected, or is it a little bit more expendable? Again, this can vary within your class structures. Like in the Mistborn example, the nobility, they view the Ska as absolutely expendable. They don't need to protect Ska life, because they're just, they're just there to do work, and they're just as common as any livestock. And then what are the valued attributes? So within American society, there's the valued attributes of, bravery and patriotism. That's the word I was looking for. Patriotism. Those sort of values, those attributes that we value within the society. And of course, this changes over time. So does your society value scholars or warriors? That will determine how they view interactions with others. So in the Skyward universe, in the second book, we learn that there's this group called the Superiority, and they despise aggression. So they don't really have warriors. They're very focused on scholarly, or if they do have any sort of battles between each other, it tends to be more strategic and manipulative than straight up fighting. So it's aggressive in a different way. And then what is their value of duty versus desire? Are people expected to do what is expected of them, to fulfill their duty, whether that is to the country, to their family, to whatever entity? Or are they more free to do what they want to do? Are they expected to take over their dad's business, or can they go pursue a life of crime? Well, not really crime, because that doesn't apply. That's a subculture thing. Or are they allowed to go say, no, instead of being a doctor, I want to be a lawyer? And then, is there a moral code within the culture that people are expected to follow? A good example of this would be the Christian 10 Commandments. Is there a list of do's and don'ts that have been set aside by the culture, by the society, that people need to follow in order to fit in? And the final thing we're going to talk about is what people do with their how people spend their time really influences how people spend their time is influenced by pretty much the rest of this. So if the society values work ethic and hard work and contribution to society, they're going to be spending a lot more time working than playing. So how much time do they spend at work? You also kind of need to split this up a little bit between white collar and blue collar jobs. Blue collar jobs, kind of your farmers, your physical labor, they don't really get much of a say in how much time they spend, especially if they're working in agriculture or farming, because they have obligations. They have to work a certain number of time. They have to work certain hours because their cows have to be milked in the morning and the evening. Their crops have to be watered at certain hours. They have to get the harvesting done in time before the crops go bad. So their time is ruled by the elements around them. However, with white-collar jobs, you have a lot more office work. They have your 9-to-5 schedule, your ability to choose your hours based on the culture and the society, but you don't have to do that all day. Some people, again, choose to do that because that's the next question, or not, the next point is success. Some people choose to work a lot because that's how their culture defines success. If they're successful, it means they've done a lot of hard work and gotten a lot of money. So one of the things you need to consider is, when determining how people use their time, is how they determine success. If it is wealth, they're going to spend a lot more time working. If it's happiness, that's a little bit different. If success is defined by something other than wealth, what are they doing to be successful? And then, are there traditions or laws that dictate work hours, breaks, and any of that? So if you have, if you consider kind of industrial revolution, there really weren't a lot of laws around factory workers. So they would be required to work 16, 20-hour days in terrible conditions and not really compensated for it because there weren't laws yet to protect them. And then traditions, there are cultures that have midday naps, the Spanish siesta, where things just shut down at 2 o'clock and people go take a 2-hour nap or just kind of relax in their homes and just do whatever, and then go back to work. In Japan, I think it's called Inamuri, And it's the idea of sleeping in public. It's a little bit of a myth that people can just sleep at their work. That's still not encouraged. But some have taken this idea that it's absolutely okay to sleep in public, and they've actually incorporated that into their works. A lot of Japanese companies have set up like napping pods so that if they are exhausted because they've been working so hard, they can just go take a quick nap at work and then get right back to it so they can be more effective and more productive. So consider that are there laws or traditions around work hours, breaks, and how they spend their time with work. And then what about their spare time? Entertainment is culture. How they choose to spend their time when they're not obligated to do something is determined so much by the culture and what they want. So, a couple of things that you can look at. What are the sports? Do you have a Quidditch type sport that you've invented for the people to participate in and for them to root for? What about games? Do your dragons go play Suburbs and Housewives? What kind of festivals are out there? This kind of lines up with your holidays. So do they have certain events that they're throwing these grand festivals for the culture? What kind of art is there? Is there theater? Is there paintings? Is there music? What do people invest in when it comes to appreciating the beauty of life and the world around them? And then music, I kind of mentioned that with the art. And most importantly, not everyone is the same. You're going to have different cultures within your world, unless it's a really, really small world and there's pretty much just like a single small continent of people. But even then, you're going to have subcultures, you're going to have countercultures, you're going to have other people that don't agree and don't fit in. Where do your characters fit within that? Are they part of the mainstream culture, or do they subvert it somehow? That's all stuff that you can determine once you've established your culture, but you have to establish it first. I hope all of that helped. These are some additional resources that you can go to. We'll have this list up as well on our website later.